Hello, my name is Mike and we're here again with another reaction video. We recently just done the reaction to the first part of OverSimplified's Russian Revolution video, and now we're going on to the second part. And we're getting on to the more commonly known revolutions in the February-March Revolution and the October-November Revolution. And the reason why I say those is not because I was unsure on the date, it's because the Western calendar that most people are familiar with and the Russian calendar are different. So in Russia, the revolutions happened in March and November of 1917, whereas the more Western, the more common understanding is the February and October revolutions. And so the way that we left off in the first part of the video was 1914. First World War has happened, and it went disastrously wrong for the Russians in the First World War. However, I'm sure that we will see that. And as always, please go over and check out the OverSimplified guys. They do a cracking job, and of course, give them your love and support over there. And if you enjoy this, if you have any feedback, any constructive criticism whatsoever, or any potential videos that you'd like to have a look at in the future, then please leave them down below. I'm eager to get back to them, and yeah, without further ado, let's get into it.
While Nicholas had been busy playing with his new best friend, tensions in Europe had been rising. It just so happened that in 1914, one Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary went for a drive with the top down in Sarajevo. One thing leads to another, and suddenly Russia found itself at war with half of Europe.
Yep.
A wave of patriotism swept through Russia. The capital was renamed to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded a bit too German. Even revolutionaries were getting on board. To them, World War I was a big stinky imperialist war, but they didn't want their big stinky imperialist replaced by a foreign one. So pretty much everyone wanted Russia to win. I hope Russia loses. Geez, read the room, Lenin. Lenin hoped Russia would lose because that would help him overthrow the Tsar. As long as he did that, who cares if Germany blows up half the country? And blow up half the country, they did.
Yeah.
An inefficient Tsarist government meant there were shortages of just about everything you need to fight a war. And if losing a teensy-weensy war with Japan upset the people, losing a giant Wyatt war like this was much worse.
As I say, because it's to remember as well, at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, Russia had the largest peacetime army in the world. It just so happens, though, that it was poorly equipped, and the Russians on the Eastern Front during the First World War had extremely difficult circumstances that they had to contend with. They had very little weapons, ammunition, food was relatively scarce, and even things like uniforms, basic necessities for fighting men was scarce, was missing. And again, it only gets worse when in the opening weeks of the war, the Russians suffer two decisive defeats after another. In the first one, they lose 90,000 prisoners of war and over 100,000 casualties, and then a few weeks later at the Battle of the Lakes, they lose another 100,000 men. And this is just the opening few weeks and months of the conflict. So what's going to happen in a prolonged engagement? But again, jumping ahead.
Soldiers were deserting, the economy was imploding, and in no time, Russia was starving. The peasants were getting more peasanty, the workers were getting more workery, all the while Germany was getting more Germanery. Dmitri, we need to win this war. I need someone with a great military mind to step in and take control. You're right. How about General Hickenlooper? How about me? You can't run the war. Who'll be in charge of the country while you're gone? Obviously, my German wife and a homeless wizard.
Yeah, so in 1915, so as I said, the Russians were facing horrible losses on the Eastern Front, similar to what I said there. And then in 1915, after Germany and Austria-Hungary had been able to advance, I think it was 300 miles into Germany, the Tsar appointed himself as commander-in-chief and personally took charge of the army, which sounds like a brilliant idea. However, when you actually get to the sense of it, was he had no military experience whatsoever. He had no understanding of tactics, of logistics, of strategy, and yet he thought that he could mastermind a global conflict against arguably probably one of the most prolific warring countries, certainly in Europe and potentially in modern history, in the Germans. And as I said, when he went to mastermind the Russian war effort, he left his wife behind with Rasputin, which is where the rumours of the affair came, which again, like I done in the last video, evidence suggests that that is just subject to propaganda and it wasn't actually true. However, what was true is she was a German, and many in Russia believed that the Tsarina was actually working with the Germans to lose Russia the war. And again, while the Tsar's not there, the authority again of him as an individual continues to get less and less, because by him taking direct control of the Russian army in 1915, that meant for every defeat wasn't the fault of some generals, it wasn't the fault of some soldiers, it was his fault, his responsibility, because he was the one controlling things. Again, it's kind of a vicious circle of autocracy, because he is the one man in power. When things go wrong, it's his fault, and then when he takes over the army, it's just another thing for people to throw at him. But yeah.
Nicholas declared himself commander-in-chief and went to the front lines, leaving his German wife in charge while they were fighting the Germans. It wasn't a good look. And because Alexander was so close to Rasputin, people believed that he was actually calling the shots and secretly destroying Russia, and maybe even boinking her. And even worser look. At this point, a bunch of nobles just couldn't take it anymore. Rasputin is destroying the country. We have to break his magic spell over the Tsar. But how? He's magic. Dude. Very cool. Hey, it's Rasputin. The sexy party is running a little late, but in the meantime, why don't you try one of these totally not poisoned cakes? Dude, why'd you say it like that? He's totally gonna know they're poisoned now. Shut up. I said they're not poisoned. Dude, he just ate so much poison. How is he still alive? It must be the magic. Go with plan B. Is he dead? See, Boris, I told you he was the Antichrist and you didn't believe me. Can you shut up for 1 minute and help me roll him up? Are you sure he's dead? I don't know, but I'm supposed to be hosting a charity auction right now. Can we get this over with? Okay, now he's dead.
Food, glorious food, our favorite diet.
I mean, that was a bit of a juxtaposition compared to meerkats. But yeah, Rasputin was murdered by a group of Russian nobles who thought that he was ruining Russia. I think that happened in 1916. However, again, a little bit like that, there was some mystery in his death, in that he was poisoned, but he seemingly was unaffected by the poison. Then they shot him several times, and he was still okay. I mean, again, it's highly subject to rumor and kind of mysticism and stuff like that, which kind of shrouded Rasputin. But the point is, he was murdered by Russian officials, or Russian nobles rather, who thought that he was a danger to Russia. But yeah.
The murder of Rasputin, just like his life, is shrouded in mystery and speculation. He probably didn't really die like that, but he also probably didn't really heal people. He probably didn't influence the Tsar as much as people thought. He probably wasn't secretly destroying the country. But what he definitely did do, even in his death, was ruin the Tsar's reputation.
Yeah.
Russia's autocracy looked more outdated than ever, and the Russian people were taking notice. Come on, men. Remember what we're fighting for. Yeah, no. We're out. World War I left Russia broke, hungry, and exhausted. And with Nicholas acting as commander-in-chief, he was getting even more blame. For the second time, Russia was on the brink of revolution.
Yeah, because particularly then as well, there was the Brezhnev offensive in 1916, I think. Yeah, it was the Brezhnev offensive, which again was disastrous for the Russians, and with that again, it led to a collapse in discipline in certain parts of the line and a collapse in morale in the military in general. And it's 1917 coming up, and Russia is a boiling point of frustration from all sectors of society. There is very few sectors in society that don't necessarily actually want some sort of change. Some want it drastically more than others, but most of Russia want some sort of change regardless.
By 1917, Russia had been fighting a war it couldn't afford for 3 years. They were running out of many things, most worryingly, food. On
Yeah.
International Women's Day, 1917, thousands of hungry women in Petrograd were so sick of being hungry that they took to the streets. And it turns out it's not just women who experience hunger, but men too. So the next day they joined in as well.
Yeah, so this is the beginning of what's kind of known as the 10 days. Or at least how I learn it and how I try and get that across to people, is there was 10 days from the 7th of March to the 17th of March. And this kind of led up to the revolution. Well, this kind of led up to and was the February March Revolution, because the day before International Women's Day, the 7th of March, something like 25,000 steel workers went out in strike because they demanded better pay, and pay talks broke down, and so they took to the streets in strike. And across the country, other workers in factories went out in strike in support of this. Then on the 8th of March, you had International Women's Day, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of women lined the streets, queuing for bread, calling for food, and more workers came out in support of both the women calling for food and the workers who were already striking. And then on the 9th, they started to be dispersed by the police and the military. However, the strikes continued. More people were still coming out. And then on the 10th, again, I'm skipping ahead of the video, but it's just to get coherent, is on the 10th of March, over 250,000 of workers were striking, which was way over 50% of the workers of Petrograd. And this essentially paralyzed the city. And the Tsar wasn't happy with it. He was distraught with the fact that while he was away, all of this was falling apart, and so he ordered that these strikers kind of be dispersed, this disruption be ceased. And so on the following day, troops fired into the crowd again. It's the second time during Nicholas II's reign where the military have fired into the crowd, and when they fired into the crowd, they killed 40 people. This again outraged people. More people across the country came out in strikes in support, and particularly as well the Duma. Remember the government that was set up in the previous part, in part 1, that was kind of not really a government. It was a government in name and not really had that much power. They quickly urged Nicholas II to reform a new government, to try and appeal to the masses, and Nicholas' response was to dismiss them and to kind of ban them from going. And so when the 12th rolled around, this was the big day. This was the massive day, is that when the troops were ordered to fire on the crowds to disperse them, the troops refused. And many of the soldiers and sailors themselves actually joined with the strikers. They joined in opposition to the Tsar, to the way things are. And in particular, the soldiers, sailors, and the workers set up the Petrograd Soviet. Whereas at a similar time, the Duma, who was ordered to disband, actually set up a provisional government on this day. So everything's going against the Tsar. And over the next couple of days, the Tsar then sets out to go to Petrograd to try and sort this out. And then it's on the way that he's informed that by the generals that the army no longer supports him. He has no support from the military. And at that point, I think it's on the 14th of March, he abdicates. And he abdicates in favour of his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who he hoped would take on the mantle and still be a Tsar. Grand Duke Michael, though, rather probably quite sensibly saw all this situation and said, I don't want to deal with that, and so he refused. And that's kind of the February March Revolution. However, again, so that's the whistle-top tour, and that's what's kind of known as the 10 days, the 10 key days of the February March Revolution, and that's how quickly it developed. But again, I've skipped ahead of the video, but this hopefully will show what I've just said.
Gatherings on the streets were forbidden, but I'm not sure how you'd arrest 250,000 people. The crowds demanded an end to the war, an end to food rationing, and even an end to the Tsar's autocracy. Now, normally the troops would deal with this kind of thing, but as it turns out, soldiers get hungry too, and they were also tired of having to kill their fellow Russians so much. So entire regiments mutinied in the capital, and they joined the crowd as well, trashing symbols of the Tsar and his autocratic regime. Things were escalating very quickly. Liberal politicians watching the riots in the streets had long been dissatisfied with the Tsar, since he would shut their parliament down anytime they did something he didn't like. They believed the only way to bring stability back to the streets was for Nicholas II to abdicate. The riots continued. The police fired on soldiers. Soldiers fired on soldiers. The workers re-established the Petrograd Soviet. Politicians began arresting the Tsar's ministers. He may have been an autocrat, but he just lost complete control of his capital city. Talk about embarrassing. Nicholas, the troops have turned against us. The people have taken over the city. They've even cut my phone line. Hello? Hello? The phones are down. Things must be bad. I'd better go back there. Nicholas hopped on the next train back to Petrograd, but he never made it to the city. His train was met by military generals and other politicians. What's going on? Nicholas, look man, we need to talk. It's not you, it's us. Aw, who am I kidding? No, it's definitely you. During the whole crisis in Petrograd, the liberals convinced the generals that if Nicholas abdicated, the people would calm down, and the generals were on board. They didn't have time to quell the chaos, because don't forget, they were still losing a global, all-encompassing war against the Germans. And with the military no longer on his side, Nicholas had no choice but to step down. Throughout his entire reign, he had done everything he could to keep all the power for himself, and in the end, that's exactly what left him with none. But
Bag a super saver deal from Co-op on Deliveroo. Get 2 tasty pizzas and a tub of your
then
Yeah, so again, when it comes to any authoritarian or dictatorial kind of power, the moment that they lose the military is the moment that they've lost, and that's exactly what happened. Yeah, and it's a bit like, so what that just described there was what I described a few moments ago, and that is what's kind of known as the 10 days, the 10 significant days of the February-March revolution. Because again, the Tsar went from having all the power in the world to suddenly it all coming down around his ears. And again, that wouldn't be the end of it though, because things were about to get a little bit more interesting, shall we say, with the Provisional Government and the Soviet in particular.
there was a big question. Who would replace Nicholas? Well, his son Alexei was next in line. Hey buddy, Daddy couldn't handle the complex socioeconomic problems of a giant multinational, multi-ethnic empire that's engaged in total war with all of Europe. You think you could give it a shot? Alexei just wasn't ready to be Tsar. Nicholas did have a brother, but given the state of the empire, he wasn't keen either. And so, 300 years of Romanov rule
So that was Grand Duke Michael.
in Russia just kind of came to an end. The earlier 1905 revolution hadn't changed much, but this new revolution had left Russia without a Tsar. And still, before the year was over, there would be one more revolution left to come.
Yep.
Nicholas's failure as commander of the armed forces was the final straw that broke the camel's back. Do you think maybe you could have done any better? Well, guess what? It's time to find out. In Rise of Kingdoms. Rise of Kingdoms is an epic, massive multiplayer, free-to-play, real-time strategy game. Choose from 11 historical civilizations, including Rome, China, or France. You can form alliances with other players, or conquer the crap out of them in real-time.
Yeah, so we have the advert here.
It's Master Tactician and handsome General Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian.
The troop is
Well, maybe, again, well, speaking of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, if there's any good videos out there about perhaps antiquity rather than more recent modern history, then yeah, leave them in the description below. I'll be happy to have a look and check them out.
You're wrong. Joan of Arc. That's right, noob. Listen up. I'm about to drop some knowledge. The commander's skill is way more important. Each Rise of Kingdoms commander has their own unique skill. Look at me. I've added attack and defense buffs to my troops. Whoa. I'm also able to cure my wounded soldiers. Cool. And I can increase their wood gathering speed by 10%. Not as cool, but okay. In Rise of Kingdoms, the decision is yours. Now go ahead, choose your favorite real historical figure, and lead your troops into real-time battle. Download Rise of Kingdoms now for free by clicking on the link in the description below. Join me and 50 million other online players and guide your civilization from a lowly clan into a great empire. Now where was I?
So there we go.
Oh yeah. Hungry woman, absolute chaos, and the end of the Tsar. Oh, hey guys, says here there's been a revolution, and the reign of the Tsars has ended. Oh, come on, I missed another one? Why am I even in this video? Well, it's not like you could have done anything. As long as there's a world war, you can't get back to Russia. Who wants to start a revolution? Revolution. Despite getting rid of Nick, Russia was still at war with half of Europe. The Germans, however, had an idea. They thought that if they helped Lenin get back, he would cause trouble for the new Russian government. So they put him on a train. Destination, Petrograd.
Yeah, so quickly, when the Tsar was deposed, when he was abdicated, the Provisional Government kind of ruled, and that was what the Duma set up during the First Revolution. And while it had some good ideas, it was utterly flawed, and it had a huge amount of weaknesses. So already previously, as I said, you had the Provisional Government, but during that same day on the 12th of March, you also had the Petrograd Soviet was set up, and really became the big deal. And those two things were competing basically for power. And really, people responded to the Soviet more than they did the Provisional Government. And the Provisional Government didn't help itself by several weaknesses. So for one, because it was temporary and it didn't see itself as a legitimate body yet, it was reluctant to pass any reforms, which meant that it didn't really pass land reform, it didn't pass other economic reforms to try and help the situation, because they deemed it was temporary, and they wanted to wait until a new constitution or a new constituent assembly could be written up, which wouldn't happen until the end of the year for them to sort out problems, and that would cause an awful lot of problems, because remember, this is February, March if you're Russian. And to have to wait until the end of the year to be able to make changes happen, that's not good enough. Also, the Provisional Government honoured its alliances with Britain and France, particularly also under threat from Britain and France, that had they pulled out of the war, then their loans for their factories and stuff like that would cease. And so the Provisional Government stayed in the war, which was draining the Russians of what little more that they actually had. And along with other things as well, they did try and make some admirable, incredible changes, like allowing freedom of speech, freedom of the press. However, what that actually just meant was any political prisoners who were released were free to completely go and criticise the Provisional Government, criticise anything that they'd done, and also organise themselves into their own dissident kind of groups, their own revolutionary groups, to kind of suppose and spouse out their own message, and combine this with the Soviet, because the Soviet, particularly with the Bolsheviks, because again you had the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks were particularly influential within the Soviet, and one of the orders, the first order, the Soviet's First Order 1, stated that the military would only act on what the Provisional Government had ordered it to had the Soviet actually okayed it. So essentially, any decisions that the Provisional Government wanted to make in regards to the military, it had to be okayed by the Soviet, otherwise the military wouldn't necessarily respond to it, because the military, again, the Soviet in Petrograd was set up by sailors, soldiers and workers, and so the armed forces were far more loyal and obedient to the new Soviet rather than the Provisional Government. And again, this would be those mistakes that I just listed there would be some of what would lead to be many. And again, in April of 1917, when this happens, Lenin is sent back to Petrograd on a train, because the Bolsheviks as well overwhelmingly want peace. And when he arrives in April, he delivers the April thesis, which he states of peace, bread and land, which I'm sure we're about to see. And I'm going to stop there before I'm getting ahead of myself and ahead of the video. But yeah.
It was a long journey, and while Lenin was cooped up in his train, things in Russia were changing. Workers were taking control of their factories. Soldiers were socking it to their mean old officers. Without a czar, a big old power vacuum had opened up, and someone needed to fill it. The liberals proposed they be in charge, and they set up the Provisional Government. The workers, however, had already begun establishing local Soviets, largely controlled by the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. And since neither felt like they had the power to oust the other, Russia ended up in a classic dual-power conundrum. The two coexisted, with the Provisional Government becoming the official government, and the elected Soviets issuing orders to the workers and soldiers. This power balance was delicate, and all it would take is one bold revolutionary to come along and give everyone a big-brained beatdown. Oh boy, Lenin's coming home. I can't wait for him to see all the great things we've accomplished. And I'm gonna show him my fan art. Oh look, here he comes now. Shut up, shut up! You all suck! The Provisional Government sucks, the Soviet sucks, even your fan art sucks! Why does he have to be so mean? In case you couldn't tell, Lenin wasn't a fan of everything that had been happening. In his April theses, he called the Provisional Government and the Soviets a bunch of big bourgeois bozos. And he kinda had a point. There was still a lot for the Russian people to be mad about. The Provisional Government hadn't got Russia out of the war, the people were still hungry, and the peasants were still hoping to get more land. Meanwhile, the Soviets hadn't done much to change things either.
Yeah.
But even though they weren't perfect, a lot of people did like what the new government had been doing. There was progress. The secret police were disbanded, the death penalty abolished. They even planned to hold elections, meaning for the first time ever, the Russian people could choose their own government. To many, Lenin seemed like some out-of-touch weirdo. If Lenin wanted to go from whiny irrelevant zero to hunky communist hero, he'd need to shake things up a bit. So he and the Bolsheviks came up with a hot new slogan that promised to give the people what the Provisional Government wouldn't.
Yeah, and this was massively popular because across the board, people wanted the First World War over. They wanted Russia pulled out of the First World War. They didn't want any part of it. And the Bolsheviks promised them that. Lenin promised them that. Land reform. The peasants for decades now had been demanding and asking for land reform, for them to have the option to purchase or just have more land to till, to try and improve their working conditions and bread. And, you know, almost the most simple necessity is food. You know, by staying in this war, by not having proper land and agricultural reforms, then food is always going to be a problem. And so with that simple 3-word slogan, Lenin was able to encapsulate almost entirely what Russian society would have liked and would have wanted.
Peace. Don't like war? We'll end it. Land. You want land? We'll give it to you. Bread. Hungry? Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
Yep.
Lenin also called for all power to the Soviets, which meant getting rid of the Provisional Government and having the Soviets run the place. A communist dream. The people liked these slogans, and bit by bit, the Bolsheviks became more popular. Some Mensheviks even began switching sides. But even though the people thought Lenin's slogans rocked, as long as the Provisional Government didn't mess up, they'd continue to support it. So let's check in on the Provisional Government. Oh, Provisional Government, you've made a big mess. The Provisional Government lasted for just 9 months, but those 9 months were chaos. The people wanted Russia out of World War I, but Minister of War Alexander Kerensky thought instead of doing that, why not do the exact opposite? If the people saw more Russian victories, they'd have to support the new government, and that went just about as well as you might expect.
Yeah. So not only did I say earlier when I said about the Russians honouring their allegiances to Britain and France and staying in the war, and also because their loans would be removed, the Russians did actually try one ill-fated offensive in June, I think. I missed the date of that. But yeah, it was again another decisive defeat, which again led to more collapse in morale within the army and various desertions as discipline broke down because people was getting war fatigue. And again, for a provisional government that has just taken over power, probably shouldn't keep something that's incredibly unpopular.
These heavy defeats worsened the Russian economy and made the hungry people hungrier. And by now, I think you know what comes next. They trashed the place. More looting, more rioting, more violence. It was like the Tsar had never abdicated. Tens of thousands of armed workers took to the streets during some of the worst violence Petrograd had seen yet. And in response, Kerensky called in the troops, who opened fire on the demonstrators.
Yep, and where have we seen that before?
For now, Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders wanted to distance themselves from the violence, but the crowds marched under Bolshevik slogans, and as a result, Kerensky, now the prime minister, took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. Their leaders were arrested. Lenin was accused of being a German agent, and he was forced to flee to Finland in disguise.
Yep, so Lenin was exiled to Siberia in the first part. Then he went to Europe, where he was in Switzerland in exile. And now, because of the July days, which some argue was actually almost a seizure of power and an attempted coup itself, he's had to flee to Finland because he was a wanted man. as a result of the protesters marching under Bolshevik banner, and that was directly connected to Lenin and his ideology.
This sucks! Now I'll never get to have my revolution. Why are you wearing a dress? It's a disguise, idiot! And it makes me feel pretty. Kerensky had successfully dealt with the violence, but he just couldn't catch a break. This increasing support for more extreme forms of socialism, along with the poor handling of the war, alarmed traditional liberals and bougie business boys. To appease them, Kerensky decided to promote a military legend to Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, someone who hated the revolution, loved the death penalty, and was devoutly anti-socialist, General Kornilov.
Yeah, so General Kornilov. Also, it must be mentioned as well that mentioned it briefly there, but Trotsky was a Menshevik, and then he switched over to the Bolsheviks, and particularly during the July days while Lenin is away, Trotsky becomes a real kind of prominent figure. He's shown to be a brilliant and outstanding organizer, and when power is handed over to General Kornilov, again, as I'm sure that we'll see, Kornilov was a Tsarist, essentially, and he hated the Provisional Government. And so when he received this, he turned his army and he was marching towards Petrograd to seize power again. And, well, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but ultimately the Provisional Government make a very strange and narrow-minded decision, which still kind of baffles me and many people who look back on this now, but we'll see.
Hey man, thanks for the promotion. That was real swell of you. Of course, with you by my side, who would dare try to overthrow me? How about me? I did not see this coming. Unfortunately for Kerensky, Kornilov hated the liberal and socialist reforms of the new government, particularly the dumb socialist soldiers' committees. The army was no place for undisciplined left-wing snowflakes. Fearing a Bolshevik takeover was imminent, Kornilov ordered his men towards Petrograd to oust the Soviet and take over. Kerensky freaked out, and he needed help. Since he knew Trotsky was finger-licking good at organizing, he and other Bolshevik leaders were released, and they, along with the Soviet, organized the defense of Petrograd. Kornilov had the power of soldiers, but the Soviet had the power of workers. And they did what workers do best. Railroad workers diverted Kornilov's men away. Telegraph workers messed with his communications. They even infiltrated his forces and encouraged the demoralized men to desert. They were also armed en masse, but in the end, no fighting was necessary because Kornilov's coup just fell apart.
Yeah, and so in that short time period, Trotsky is shown to be a extremely prolific organizer, as I previously said. It showed the workers and their ability to coordinate in bringing down threats to themselves, and that would be again reflected in the Russian Civil War, which I don't know if this video will show. But particularly as well, the Provisional Government arms the Bolsheviks. The Provisional Government arms the Bolsheviks. The Red Guard is formed. And so the Provisional Government, who was cracking down on Bolsheviks, only this happened in August. So the Bolsheviks that were being cracked down on during the July days had now suddenly been armed by the Provisional Government that was cracking down on them to fight an outside force, which ultimately never actually needed to fight. But the point is, you now have a load of Bolsheviks, of people that you don't like, walking around with weapons that you gave them. And what kind of authority does it show when the government needs to rely on a political movement to defend itself from an external force? It's not a very good image to have.
And Kornilov was sent straight to prison. Everything was coming up Kerensky. Hey, thanks for the help, boys. Couldn't have done it without you. Now that there's no longer any threat, how about you, return all those guns I gave you? No.
Yep.
Oh, no. In order to kill a rat, Kerensky had just given a gun to a bear. A Bolshevik bear. The whole affair was a huge propaganda win for them. They had defended the revolution, and their popularity skyrocketed. They found themselves elected to the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, with Trotsky even becoming chairman in Petrograd. They were now in a very powerful position. Almost powerful enough for Lenin to return home from Finland and finally stage his long-awaited communist revolution. The Bolsheviks began planning their takeover of the Russian government. Some got cold feet and began arguing against Lenin's armed revolution in favor of a more peaceful approach, and they even wrote newspaper articles about it, which kind of gave the whole scheme away. The Bolsheviks are planning an armed revolution? I did not see this coming. Kerensky began arresting Bolsheviks, and as a result, Lenin and the boys felt they had no choice but to commence the revolution right now.
Yeah.
Lenin was back in Petrograd, but was still in hiding, so Trotsky got the ball rolling, using his position as Soviet chairman to organize the Bolshevik militias. Now, if you were to ask Soviet artists, the revolution went something like this. As much as they would like you to think it was a glorious, violent, heroic takeover, the truth seems to be a little more underwhelming. The Bolsheviks just kind of walked into key buildings in the city and took control.
Yeah, so that's essentially what happened. Was in November in the Russian calendar, you had Leon Trotsky's Red Guards seized different infrastructure, vital infrastructure within Petrograd, so government buildings, cut telephone wires, train stations, occupied those, for example. And then the following day, the Russian warship, the Aurora, I think it was, fired a shell over the Winter Palace where the Provisional Government was meeting, and the Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, to no resistance, and the handover of power was relatively, well, it was a damp squib. The Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, and the Provisional Government just kind of said, all right, you boys are in power now. So yeah, it wasn't very violent at all, which is a good thing, because violence isn't good, but it's not the big heroic propaganda move they've done. And a fun fact as well is in the film itself, actually, of the Bolshevik seizure of power, the film that was made shortly afterwards, which depicted the heroic Red Guards storming the Winter Palace and shooting at the palace guards and stuff like that. More people died in the filming of that film than they did in the actual seizure of power. Just putting that out there, another fun fact for you. So yeah.
Bolsheviks supporting sailors even brought in a huge battleship, but there wasn't really any fighting. Nobody really tried to stop them. In just one day, they took control of the city. Next, Kerensky just managed to escape before the Bolsheviks surrounded the Winter Palace, placing the Provisional Government under siege inside. Is it safe to come out yet? I think so. Fear my revolutionary might! Give me that. That night, Lenin came out of hiding to play a bigger role in the revolution. With him back at the helm, they had one more job to do: storm the Winter Palace and arrest the Provisional Government. And here comes the final showdown. The palace was defended by a force known as the Battalion of Death, who immediately gave up. And just like that, Lenin had won. As far as violent, bloody revolutionary uprisings go, this wasn't really one of them. But Lenin was finally in charge of Russia. He had spent his whole life dreaming of this moment. He set up the first Council of People's Commissars, his own cabinet with him in charge. This was it, his chance to finally make his communist utopia with equality and freedoms beyond compare. Hey Lenin, before we took power, they were planning on holding elections. Shall we go ahead with those? Of course. You can't have a communist utopia without high levels of political participation. The proletariat should be free to elect who it. What? The social revolutionaries won. We lost. Those don't count. Lenin claimed the elections were unfair, and the Constituent Assembly they created was counter-revolutionary. He presented the new assembly with a motion that basically said, sign here and give up your power. And when the assembly was like, no, Lenin said, see, they're disobeying me. Proof they're counter-revolutionary. Shut it down, boys. Moderate socialists and others weren't happy when Lenin had the assembly closed by force, and when campaigners began taking to the streets, they were fired upon. For Lenin...
Yep, again, replacing one authoritarian dictator with another authoritarian. Again, it's a vicious cycle, and yeah, this would only go on to get worse, as I'm sure we're about to see.
Setting up a communist utopia was looking suspiciously like setting up a dictatorship. While he was implementing many of the communist policies you'd expect, he was also refusing to work with other political parties and cracking down on opposition. Hey Lenin, are you setting up a dictatorship? I'll shoot you if you are. Of course not. What a crazy theory. Anyway, I'm pleased to announce I'm setting up a secret police force to repress and kill traitors. And by traitors, I of course mean anyone not loyal to me. Owie, 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 owie. The assassination attempt made on Lenin's life in August 1918 failed, but in response, the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. But while all of this chaos was erupting back home, Lenin and the boys were also distracted by another problem. They were still at war with the Germans, and they had promised to give the people peace. So Lenin made Trotsky Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and sent him off to negotiate a peace deal with the Germans. The Germans offered Trotsky really harsh terms, because they were winning the war. They demanded Russia give up a butt-ton of land, something that would be devastating to the economy. Look, I know it's not great, but I think we have to accept it. Are you insane? This will ruin us. Hey Trotsky, you got a big brain. What do you think? How about no war, no peace? What's that, Mr. Trotsky, sir? It's simple. No war means we'll stop fighting the Germans, but no peace means we won't sign the peace treaty either. Then, when the Germans say we've just stopped fighting, they'll have to leave us alone or something. Trotsky, that's genius! I could kiss you. Do you want me to kiss you? Stop asking me that. Trotsky's no war, no peace plan was a huge success. Oh, wait, no, just kidding. It went exactly as you'd imagine. When the Germans saw the Russians had stopped fighting, they slammed 700,000 troops deep into Russian territory with no resistance. Now, the new peace treaty offered by the Germans was way worse, with Russia losing a huge amount of territory, population, and resources. The Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept, and Russia was humiliated. With Petrograd now in an exposed position, Lenin moved the capital to Moscow, just in case. Things really weren't going well for Lenin, and many people were extremely unhappy with the Bolshevik government and its actions. Lenin, you pissed off so many people that they've united against you. We're under attack. Relax, we always expected some counter-revolutionary pushback. I think we can handle a few angry monopoly men. But Lenin, it's not just the monopoly men. Okay, who are we up against? Well, the liberals, the social revolutionaries, national separatists in Poland, Finland, and the Ukraine, independent warlords setting up chiefdoms, anarchist rebels, the Green Peasant Armies, the Cossacks, the Caucasian states, the Baltic states, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese. Oh, and a legion of Czechoslovakian soldiers seem to have taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway and stolen all the imperial gold reserves.
The Russian Civil War just happened. And quickly as well, that World War I treaty is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, or Litovsk, however you pronounce the word. Apologies, my pronunciation isn't brilliant. But yeah, and so after doing that, had disastrous results in particular. And then, because it annoyed so many people, it led to the Russian Civil War, where you had the Reds against the Whites, the Reds being the Bolsheviks and the Whites being practically everybody opposed to them. You had the Czechoslovakian Legion, who seized the Trans-Siberian Railway. You had the Western powers as well, who wanted to get involved because, again, they deemed that the Bolsheviks were dangerous. But ultimately, a lot of the groups of the Whites, as they were collectively known, were disorganized. They weren't connected. They weren't working together. A lot of them had separate aims that they weren't able to really coordinate or work together, or some just plain weren't willing to work with each other, which just meant that the Bolsheviks had a lot easier job fighting the war than they would have had otherwise, because it's a lot easier to divide and conquer than it is to fight several coordinated foes at once. But yeah.
What? How could this get any worse? Oh, and it says here your mother-in-law is coming to stay. No! A variety of anti-Bolshevik forces had united together to topple Lenin's government, and Russia descended into a full-blown civil war. Now, the Russian Civil War was extremely intricate and would really need its own video, but essentially, the anti-Bolshevik white movement gained control of vast underdeveloped areas, while the Bolshevik Reds controlled the industrial heartland. Using this to their advantage, along with the surprising military genius of Trotsky and the shocking disorganization of the White Army, the fortified Red Army gradually came out on top. It was an absolutely brutal conflict, with both sides committing horrendous atrocities. To maintain order at home, the Bolsheviks began the Red Terror.
Yeah.
And the secret police would execute tens of thousands of suspected traitors. No one was safe from the violence, not even Nicholas himself. You've probably been wondering what Nicholas has been up to this whole time. Well, after his abdication, he and his family were placed under house arrest. At first, they were allowed to live in their usual luxury, but after Lenin took over, their conditions worsened. The Bolsheviks were just holding on to Nick until they could work out what to do with him, but the Civil War complicated things. The last thing they wanted was for Nick to be freed by the White Armies, and so, to stop this from happening, Nicholas's Bolshevik guards decided to act. It's not entirely certain whether Lenin ordered it, or if the guards were acting on their own volition. But on July 17th, 1918, with White Armies approaching, they woke Nicholas and his family in the middle of the night and brought them into the basement. There, a drunken squad of Bolsheviks murdered the entire family. Nicholas, the last Tsar, once one of the most powerful men alive, had met a brutal end.
Yeah, and particularly as well, it wasn't just it wasn't an assassination really, it was murder. As I said, like I mentioned in the first part, I have recently been reading a book about famous assassinations in the past, and I knew obviously the fate of Nicholas II and his family. I knew that they was murdered. However, when you actually get to the grisly details of how it happened, it's relatively horrific. It wasn't a coordinated assassination at all. It was type of things where Nicholas himself had an entire magazine unloaded into his chest. His son, his son, his young daughters and stuff were shot several times after they was already dead, just in drunken fervour. And even it wasn't just the family themselves; it was their servants. Some of their nannies. That was included with the family was also not spared. They also suffered the same fate as the family themselves, and even the way that they was their corpses were dealt with is horrible as well, because they weren't given a proper burial either. At first, they tried to put them down a mine shaft, an abandoned mine shaft, but it was too shallow. And so they had to move them then from there to somewhere else. It was a hack job, and yeah, I said it's not for the faint of heart into reading it, and I don't want to get into too much detail because it's not particularly pleasant. However, yeah, that was the thing. The Bolsheviks couldn't dare have Nicholas II freed, because it would be a rallying cry. Although how unpopular he was when he was deposed, the Bolsheviks were also extremely unpopular at this moment, because they were authoritarian, they were repressive, and so Nicholas II being restored would be a rallying cry, and the Bolsheviks couldn't afford to let that happen. And also, just talking about the Red Terror. The Red Terror, again, similar to the secret police of the Okhrana and stuff like that, but except arguably much worse. They committed real atrocities, gave summary executions to people just accused of being traitors or being dissidents. There wasn't necessarily evidence involved, and in general terms, the Red Terror carried out by that secret police would become the model of the NKVD and stuff like that in later years. Later years throughout the Soviet Union. So the Whites obviously also did carry out atrocities themselves. The particularly forces that were still relatively loyal to the Tsar carried out extreme I've forgotten the word of it now. Retaliation. Yeah, they retaliated in kind. However, yeah, it's called Red Terror for a reason. And obviously, the assassination of Nicholas II and stuff like that completely ended the Romanov dynasty, well, forever.
But after years of fighting and millions of deaths, Trotsky and his Red Army came out victorious. Wow, that was a close one. Okay, back to creating a communist utopia. How are we doing on that? Well, the Civil War helped create a massive famine, and about 5 million people starved to death. There's massive inflation and the ruble is worthless. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of railway track have been destroyed. Disease and epidemics have killed 3 million. The population in Moscow and Petrograd has collapsed. Life expectancy has plummeted. Sailors in Kronstadt are rebelling. People are freezing to death in their own apartments, and life has been reduced to a constant search for food and shelter. Whoa. Well, this just means I'll have to work twice as hard, day and night, to save the country. Nothing will stop me, short of a couple sudden strokes. Get the doctor. One thing you have to keep in mind is that everything I've been talking about, the Civil War, the assassination attempt, and Lenin's struggle to maintain control at home, were all happening around the same time, and it must have been extremely stressful. Lenin began getting headaches, insomnia, and in 1922, he suffered 2 separate strokes. As the Soviet Union was officially declared under a strict one-party system, Lenin's health continued to decline, and his ability to lead the Communist Party went with it. Everybody assumed Trotsky would succeed him. He was a great speaker, he'd won the Civil War, and he had a dope-ass train. The last person anyone expected to take over was Stalin.
Joseph Stalin.
Wasn't a great intellectual like Lenin, or a charismatic war hero like Trotsky. He was, as one Menshevik described him, a grey blur. Someone who operated in the background. Someone who you might not even notice. But it was in the background that Stalin would rise to power. Here's how it happened. After the revolution, all the Bolsheviks hoped to get a cool job in the new government. What did you get? Commissar for War. Sweet! What'd you get? Secretary. Stalin was made general secretary for the Communist Party. It wasn't what he wanted, but Stalin quickly realized that even though it wasn't fancy, it was a powerful position. As secretary, he had the power to give people jobs within the party.
Yeah, which made him extremely powerful. Because, again, the rise of Stalin is a massive wormhole in itself that you can get down. Particularly how he actually positions himself to become in power. By him being able to give people jobs in different roles allowed him to manipulate and kind of flood positions where he needed to with people who was like him, akin to him, and if needed to depose or overrule those who had been given their jobs by other people by virtue of him being simply able to outnumber them with his supporters as opposed to his opponents. So although it seemed like a very low bearing position to have as secretary, it was extremely powerful. And Stalin, if anything, wasn't manipulative, and he used that to his advantage.
So he would give jobs to all of his pals, who in turn would give him their support. The more pals he gave jobs, the more power he got. The more power he got, the more pals he got. Lenin may have been having wall-to-wall strokes, but he was still involved in the party, and he was taking notice. He wasn't a fan of Stalin abusing his position, or insulting his wife to her face. Lenin knew he couldn't let Stalin take over, but by this stage, he was just too sick to fight it. Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir. Well, déjà vu. Lenin's last wish was to not let Stalin take over, but by the time he died, Stalin was too powerful to remove. He had his remaining opponents arrested or killed. Trotsky was banished and fled to Europe. Eventually, he would be assassinated by Soviet spies in 1940.
Yep.
Our dear comrade Lenin has died. We should have a state funeral. No. Let's mummify him and put him on display so people can look at his dead body forever.
So just quickly as well, the opposition is, after Lenin died particularly as well, Stalin even went so far as to give Trotsky wrong information. So Trotsky wouldn't be actually at the funeral when Lenin was there, to make Stalin look like he was Lenin's best friend who was closest to him and stuff like that, to win popularity. And he kind of almost built a cult of personality around Lenin. Around how close of a relationship he had with Lenin and stuff like that, and Trotsky was driven to the side. And over a number of months and years, a bit like what they said, again, this is extremely simple for even me saying this and stuff, but you have some of the key individuals of the actual revolution themselves, Zioniev and Kamenev and stuff like that, who were part of the Soviet and part of the revolutions from the very beginning, suddenly finding themselves having show trials and being dismissed from the party or exiled or, murdered because they was accused of being traitors or traitors to the revolution and traitors to the state and stuff like that. And again, the show trials were a big thing, and they were to become a big staple in the Soviet Union as well, of people being supposed to be having shown trials, but the judge was corrupt, the jury was corrupt, and the evidence against them was almost entirely fabricated, if not vastly outlandish. And then when the guilty verdict comes through, you can suddenly just go, look, they're guilty, and then give them a death sentence, and nobody bats an eyelid. And Stalin, over a series of months and years, used his position as secretary to essentially destroy any other influential people within the party who could threaten his power vacuum, and that's what he done. And that's generally how he became to the position in running the Soviet Union. And Trotsky himself, he fled to Europe, and then he eventually fled to Mexico, where he was murdered, I believe, with an ice pick as well. There's another fun fact for you. Don't know why the murderer would use an ice pick in Mexico, but there we go.
That's gross. You're gross. Guards, kill him. Lenin had waited so long to take control in Russia, but he never got to see his communist utopia. His short time in charge was spent dealing with the destroyed Russian economy, World War I, and the Civil War. He was cruel and merciless, but he really did seem to believe communism would make Russia a better place. Stalin, on the other hand, would take the Soviet Union down a different path. If you thought Lenin was a tyrant, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, girl. A secret police state, a rapidly militarizing superpower, led by a paranoid man who deeply distrusted the West, would see the world come to the brink of nuclear annihilation. That's right, I'm talking about... Remember to click the link in the description below to download Rise of Kingdoms for free. Fight alongside allies, conquer other players, and use superior tactics to emerge victorious in it.
Okay, so that's the end of the video, bar the advert, it seems. And so, yeah, so that's the end of that video. It was entertaining, again, interesting. They always seem to do a really good job, the Oversimplified guys, and I've hoped I've been able to share a little bit of extra information. Now, hopefully some of you might not have known beforehand, or help with understanding where sometimes you might still be a little bit confused after the video. And yeah, so I've had a lot of fun watching this. I've learned some new things as well for myself, and yeah, I've had a lot of fun doing this. And so please go head over to Oversimplified, check them out, give them like, your support, subscription if you haven't already. I mean, how are you here if you haven't actually seen the actual video? And of course, if you've enjoyed this, and I'd very much appreciate like, comments on feedback or constructive criticism, or just future recommendations for videos. Like I said, I'm really enjoying the Oversimplified stuff. There's still a lot of those videos that I haven't actually watched properly yet. Or do you want me to maybe grasp at a different series of videos that might deal with the conflicts of the 20th century in greater detail, or different time periods altogether? You know, I'm open to suggestions, and yeah, so without further ado, please again head over to the Oversimplified guys, give them a like and support, and without further ado, thank you for watching, and be safe, guys. Thank you, bye.